November 1st, 2004, just after 2 a.m., in a quiet residential neighborhood on Dorset Street in Napa, California, two young women were attacked inside a home that had never felt dangerous. Leslie Mazzara and Adriana Insogna, both 26 years old, were stabbed to death in their bedrooms. A third roommate survived, not because the house protected her, but because she recognized the danger quickly enough to escape. This case did not happen in isolation. There was no forced entry, no theft, no stranger crashing in from the dark. What happened in Napa forces a closer examination of assumed safety, as familiarity, shared routines, and social proximity can quietly replace vigilance. When a place feels safe, when the people around us feel known, how long before we stop questioning what that safety is built on? Three women shared the townhouse on Dorset Street. Leslie Mazzara worked as a waitress and was known for her social warmth. Adriana Insogna was an engineer with the Napa Sanitation District, closely bonded with her co-workers and friends. The third roommate, Lauren Mayanza, lived downstairs. On the night of October 31st, Halloween came and went without incident. Leslie and Adriana went upstairs to sleep. Lauren went to bed downstairs. The doors were unlocked as they often were. Nothing felt out of place. Shortly after 2 a.m., that sense of normalcy fractured. Lauren was startled awake by the sound of glass breaking. Almost immediately, she heard screams coming from upstairs. She moved toward the stairs. In the darkness, she encountered the intruder. She could not see his face clearly, but the threat was unmistakable. There was no confusion about what was happening. Lauren ran. She fled out the back door, barefoot, and hid outside. She believed the attacker might still be inside the house. Only after the noise stopped, only after the intruder fled, did she re-enter. That was when she discovered Leslie and Adriana. The discovery did not come hours later. It came within minutes of the attack. This detail is necessary because it reveals how quickly violence can overwhelm even immediate recognition, and how thin the margin is between awareness and irreversible harm. When Napa police arrived, the crime scene immediately challenged the idea of randomness. There was no forced entry. Nothing of value had been taken. The violence was focused and personal. One small but critical detail stood out. Cigarette butts left behind at the scene. The brand, Camel Turkish Gold, did not belong to any of the residents. Neither victim smoked. That detail became a behavioral signature. Over the following months, investigators conducted more than 1,300 interviews and collected over 200 DNA samples. The case remained open. The community waited. Pressure mounted. Nearly a year later, DNA from the cigarette butts matched Eric Matthew Koppel. Koppel was not a stranger to the victim's world. He was the fiancé, later husband, of Lily Prudhomme, Adriana Insogna's best friend and coworker. This placed Koppel firmly inside the victim's extended social circle. He had been inside the home before. He was familiar. He did not need to force entry. Prosecutors later argued that Koppel was driven by extreme jealousy. He believed Adriana's close friendship with Lily was pulling Lily away from him. He reportedly felt Adriana was encouraging Lily to leave the relationship. This was not presented as a sudden break. It was described as escalating resentment, building quietly over time. From a forensic psychology standpoint, this pattern is especially dangerous. Jealousy-driven violence often relies on displacement. The perceived obstacle becomes the target. The person is no longer seen as a friend or peer, but as a threat to control. Koppel was arrested in September 2005. Faced with overwhelming forensic evidence, he later pleaded guilty to the murders. The danger did not come from outside the social circle. It came from within it. In 2006, Eric Koppel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders of Leslie Mazzara and Adriana Insogna. We now proceed to the second case. San Jose, California, on the night of October 31st, 1984. Looked exactly like it was supposed to. It was not a city on edge. It was not a place bracing for danger. It was ordinary in the specific, ritualized way that Halloween makes ordinary life feel safe. Porch lights glowed steadily along residential streets, signaling welcome rather than warning. Children moved from house to house in loose clusters, their footsteps quick and careless, their attention fixed on candy bowls and familiar routes. Costumes, blurred faces, and softened identities. Noise carried farther than usual and meant less than it normally would. Laughter, shouting, running feet, sounds that might otherwise prompt concern were reclassified as celebration. It was a night when unfamiliar movement was anticipated rather than questioned, when raised voices could be dismissed as excitement or play, when doors opened more readily than they did on any other night of the year. Suspicion felt unnecessary, even impolite. Halloween did what it always does. It rewrote the rules of vigilance without anyone consciously agreeing to it. Inside one home lived Doreen Erbert, 8 months pregnant, attempting to move forward with a life that had already absorbed an irreversible loss. She was not untouched by tragedy. She had already buried a child. She had already survived something that reshaped her life and her relationships. Yet she was trying to continue, remarried, preparing for a new child, rebuilding a future that did not erase the past, but did not remain trapped inside it either. Outside that home was William Michael Dennis, carrying a grievance that had been 4 years in the making. His presence that night did not begin with Halloween. It did not begin with a costume or a noise or a chance encounter. It arrived fully formed, shaped by years of fixation. The violence that followed did not originate on that street, but it was enabled there by familiarity, by lowered guard, by a night designed to absorb disruption without immediate alarm. The motive came long before Halloween. In 1980, Dennis and Doreen's 3-year-old son Paul accidentally drowned in a swimming pool while in Doreen's care. Authorities investigated the incident. It was examined, documented, and ultimately ruled an accident. No criminal charges were filed. The state concluded its role. The case was closed. Dennis never accepted that conclusion. He blamed Doreen entirely, not circumstance, not a chain of unfortunate events, not misfortune. The clarity of that blame is important. It did not fluctuate. It did not soften. It did not evolve into shared responsibility or tragic inevitability. It stayed fixed, unyielding, and personal. That blame did not fade with time. It hardened. Instead of loosening under distance or legal resolution, it became more rigid. Dennis pursued a wrongful death civil lawsuit against Doreen, alleging that she was responsible for their son's death. The court examined the claim and rejected it. The lawsuit failed. Legally, the matter ended there. The judicial system did not validate Dennis's narrative. Psychologically, however, the rejection had the opposite effect. The blame did not dissolve, it calcified. This is where motive forms, not in rage, but in rejected blame. Dennis did not reinterpret the loss after the lawsuit failed. He did not integrate the court's ruling into a new understanding of the past. He preserved the grievance exactly as it was. When the justice system refused to confirm his narrative, he began constructing one of his own, one in which accountability would be enforced outside institutional boundaries. Investigators would later find the clearest evidence of motive not in Dennis's words, but in his actions. In his garage, police discovered 2 handmade coffins, one intended for Doreen, the other for her current husband, Charles. This detail was not symbolic, it was practical. Coffins are not impulsive objects. They are not the product of a fleeting emotional surge. They require time, materials, labor, and sustained commitment. They represent planning carried out in advance, quietly and deliberately. Those coffins existed before Halloween, before any claimed emotional trigger, before the night itself. Whatever Dennis felt on October 31st, the plan already existed. This is the line the jury would later draw, and it is a crucial one. Preparation is incompatible with loss of control. Emotional intensity does not erase intent when intent has already taken physical form. Dennis went to Doreen's home in San Jose that night. The attack that followed killed Doreen and her unborn child. Inside the house was Deanna, Doreen's 4-year-old daughter from a later marriage. She witnessed the attack from behind a couch, small, silent, hidden, but present. That detail anchors the crime in reality. It was not an abstract act of violence. It occurred in a living space, in front of a child who would carry the memory forward. Police did not rely on psychological theories to identify the suspect. They relied on evidence. Officers followed a literal trail of blood from the crime scene to Dennis's home. The path was direct. The link was physical. Evidence closed the loop. Dennis was convicted in Santa Clara County Superior Court of first-degree murder for Doreen and second-degree murder for the fetus under the California Penal Code, which explicitly allowed fetal homicide charges at the time. The jury rejected the psychotic break defense. The verdict recognized intent, preparation, and responsibility. Decades later, in October 2024, Dennis's death sentence was vacated and replaced with life without the possibility of parole. The convictions remain intact. Guilt was never in question. What changed was the state's approach to punishment, not its judgment of what occurred. If you appreciate true crime stories told with care and depth, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue researching and sharing the cases that deserve to be remembered. Up next is Case 3. Halloween is a night built on controlled fear. Masks signal play, costumes signal fantasy. Streets fill with children practicing bravery in small, rehearsed doses, knocking on doors, laughing at plastic skeletons, trusting that nothing behind the decorations is real. Threats are assumed to be pretend. On October 31, 2015, that assumption proved fatal in Brandon, Florida. Tiffany James, a 35-year-old mother of 7-year-old twin daughters, was doing what millions of parents do on Halloween night. She walked her children through their neighborhood, supervised their excitement, collected candy, and guided them safely back home. The night followed a familiar script. Nothing about it suggested danger. That expectation, that Halloween is insulated from real harm, was exactly what made what happened next possible. As Tiffany and her daughters returned to their home, a figure was waiting outside. He did not stand out. He did not trigger alarm. He blended into the evening's logic. Daryl Eugene Williams, Tiffany's former partner and the children's father, was wearing a Jason mask. On a different night, the mask would have been alarming. On Halloween, it was invisible in plain sight. It signaled costume, not intent. It offered concealment without suspicion. Moments later, Williams shot Tiffany James, killing her in front of her children. The violence was immediate and irreversible. The twins witnessed the loss of their mother at an age when safety is supposed to be assumed, not questioned. Williams fled the scene, leaving behind a neighborhood stunned into silence and 2 children forced into a reality no costume could soften. For days, law enforcement searched for Williams. The search ended quietly. He was arrested without incident at his workplace, a phosphate plant in Riverview, Florida. The contrast was stark. The crime had been public, sudden, and devastating. The arrest was procedural, calm, and uneventful. From the system's perspective, order had been restored. From the family's perspective, nothing had been repaired. Prosecutors initially charged Williams with first-degree murder with a firearm, and he was held without bond. The charge reflected the seriousness of the act. But the case never went to trial. In 2017, Williams accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The agreement was supported by Tiffany James's family, not because the crime deserved leniency, but because a trial would have required the twin daughters to testify about witnessing their mother's death. The plea was a form of protection for the children, not a statement about justice. Williams is currently scheduled for release in 2035. Legally, the case is closed. Psychologically and systemically, it is not. The most disturbing aspect of this case is not the moment of violence on Halloween night. It is how thoroughly the risk had been documented before it happened. Between 2011 and 2015, both Tiffany James and Darrell Williams filed multiple petitions for protective orders against each other. Every single petition was denied. Judges repeatedly cited insufficient evidence, applying a standard that treats danger as something that must be proven beyond pattern, beyond repetition, beyond warning. But the filings themselves tell a clearer story. Court records show that Tiffany James documented explicit threats. Williams allegedly told her that her family should prepare for a funeral. This was not vague language. It was direct. It was specific. It was recorded. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Williams was reported to have stalked James at her workplace. He was also suspected of tampering with her car, including disabling her gas tank. Each incident was logged. Each concern was raised. None were deemed actionable. In domestic violence research, these behaviors are not neutral. They are escalation markers. Stalking after separation, threats involving death, interference with transportation, and fixation following custody disputes form a well-established pattern. They are not isolated acts. They are signals of increasing risk. Yet within the legal process, they were treated as individual complaints rather than a connected trajectory. Then came the trigger. On October 30th, 2015, one day before the murder, Tiffany James was awarded custody of the twins in court. Forensic and public health research consistently identifies custody loss as one of the highest risk moments for lethal violence in abusive relationships. Moving on to Case 4. Shortly after 1 a.m. on Saturday, October 25, 2025, a Halloween party on Dixon Drive, just outside the town of Maxton, North Carolina, was still growing. Cars crowded the narrow road. Music carried into the darkness. The crowd had swelled to approximately 300 people. Within moments, gunfire tore through the crowd. When it stopped, 13 people had been shot. 2 were dead. One was Nehemiah Locklear, 16 years old. The other was Jesse Locklear Jr., 49. This was not a sudden tragedy with a single cause. It was the result of conditions that formed quietly through eroding boundaries, absent authority, and escalating risk in a space where no one was truly in control. This is the story of how that environment collapsed and why justice has proven so difficult to deliver. Maxton sits in Robeson County, an area long shaped by economic pressure, limited youth infrastructure, and fragmented systems of oversight. Large social gatherings are common, often organized informally through social media and word of mouth. The Halloween party on Dixon Drive followed that pattern, but investigators later determined it was not simply a private gathering. According to law enforcement and regulatory findings, the event was an unlicensed commercial party. Organizers sold entry tickets. Alcohol was sold without permits. Teenagers were present. None of the safeguards required for an event of this size were in place. As the night progressed, the crowd continued to grow. Law enforcement estimates placed attendance at around 300 people, far beyond what the property could safely accommodate. Teenagers and adults mixed freely. Alcohol consumption was widespread. Firearms were present throughout the crowd. Nehemiah Locklear arrived in this environment as many teenagers do, expecting a night of music and celebration, not violence. At 16, he was still navigating adolescence, a period marked by heightened emotional response and incomplete impulse regulation. But individual psychology alone does not explain what happened. The environment itself was unstable. There was no legitimate authority managing the event, no effective crowd control, and no reliable mechanism to stop conflict once it begins. Violence in crowded social settings rarely arrives suddenly. It enters through erosion. Physical boundaries erode first. A private residence becomes an open venue. Entry is no longer controlled. Capacity limits disappear. What begins as a party transforms into a mass event without ownership. Social boundaries follow. Teenagers mix with adults. Strangers mix with acquaintances. Alcohol circulates without oversight. Accountability thins, not because people intend harm, but because no one holds legitimate authority. Organizers did hire security, but investigators later confirmed these individuals were unlicensed and unbonded in violation of North Carolina private protective security laws. Their presence created the appearance of control without the legal authority to enforce it. This is not protection, it is confusion. Emotional boundaries collapse last. Alcohol lowers inhibition. Group dynamics amplify perceived slights. Arguments that might have ended with distance instead linger in dense crowds where there is nowhere to step away. Each moment feels manageable. Each escalation feels temporary. No single step feels decisive. Until it is. According to the Robeson County Sheriff's Office, multiple individuals produced firearms as arguments escalated. Within seconds, gunfire erupted across the property. By the time deputies arrived, the violence had already unfolded. The scene investigators encountered was chaos. 2 people were dead. 11 others were wounded by gunfire. Victims were scattered across the property and nearby areas. Witnesses fled in panic. Shell casings covered the ground. Sheriff Bernice Wilkins later confirmed that at least 14 different firearms were discharged during the shooting. 14 weapons, 1 crowded property, hundreds of people moving at once. From a forensic standpoint, this created a labyrinth. Ballistic reconstruction relies on clarity, matching bullets to weapons, weapons to shooters, shooters to victims. In a scene involving 14 firearms, that clarity fractures, trajectories overlap, timelines blur, witness accounts conflict. Who fired first? Which bullet struck which victim? At what point did reckless behavior become criminal homicide? These questions determine whether charges can be filed and whether those charges can survive in court. As of when this video was uploaded, no arrests have been made for the homicides. Shooter identification remains an active and unresolved investigation. In November 2025, investigators shifted focus to the conditions that allowed the violence to occur. 6 individuals were charged with more than 70 criminal offenses related to organizing and operating the unlicensed event. Those charged included Michael Keith Locklear, 41, charged with more than 20 counts tied to operating the illegal event. Casey Locklear, 40, charged with multiple counts of child abuse. Haven Harden, 18, charged with child abuse. Paul Chavis, 33, and Jason Brown, 49, each charged with misdemeanor violations of private protective security law. Robert Earl Jacobs, 34, charged with 11 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a juvenile. These charges addressed alcohol violations, juvenile endangerment, and unlawful security operations. They did not address the gunfire itself. Organizational liability explains how the environment became dangerous. It does not explain who pulled the trigger. If you value honest, in-depth true crime coverage, tap like and subscribe to stay with us. Your support helps us keep uncovering the stories that still need a voice. Case 5. On October 31, 1974, in the Houston area communities of Deer Park and Pasadena, Texas, the perceived safety of Halloween failed, not because of a stranger, but because of a father. Ronald Clark O'Brien was 30 years old. He was married, active in his church, and outwardly indistinguishable from the other parents walking their children door to door that night. He didn't force entry. He didn't hide. He didn't rush. He was trusted. By the early hours of November 1st, his 8-year-old son, Timothy, was dead. This case is often remembered as a warning about poisoned Halloween candy, but that framing misunderstands what made the crime possible. The violence did not arrive through chaos or anonymity. It moved quietly, politely, and exactly as expected. This was a murder enabled by unchallenged access, harm that entered because no one believed there was anything to stop. By the fall of 1974, Ronald O'Brien was under mounting financial pressure. Court testimony and financial records introduced at trial showed he was deeply in debt, behind on bills, and struggling to maintain stability. Creditors were calling. His employment situation was uncertain. The strain was persistent. Earlier that year, O'Brien took out multiple life insurance policies on his two children, Timothy and Elizabeth. Trial records and contemporaneous reporting place the confirmed payout between approximately $31,000 and $60,000, depending on the carrier and policy terms. Some investigative sources later suggested the total potential payout may have approached $100,000 due to overlapping policies taken out in the months and, in at least one case, days before Halloween. What mattered to investigators was not the exact final figure, but the pattern. Multiple policies, voluntarily obtained without medical necessity during a period of financial instability. On Halloween night, October 31st, 1974, O'Brien took Timothy and Elizabeth trick-or-treating with several children from the neighborhood. At one stop, he later claimed a man answered the door of a dark house and handed him several oversized Pixie Stix candies, which O'Brien said he distributed later. The claim blended easily into the noise of the night. Trick-or-treating is informal by design. Adults are distracted. Children move quickly. Nothing about the moment invites scrutiny. After returning home, O'Brien handed out the Pixie Stix. Timothy received one. Within an hour, Timothy became violently ill. He vomited repeatedly, complained of severe pain, and collapsed. Emergency responders rushed him to the hospital, but doctors were unable to save him. Timothy O'Brien was pronounced dead in the early morning hours of November 1st, 1974. As news spread, fear followed. Reports of poisoned Halloween candy circulated rapidly across Texas. Parents panicked. Schools issued warnings. The threat seemed invisible and everywhere. Ronald O'Brien allowed that fear to grow, directed away from himself. The autopsy removed all uncertainty. Timothy O'Brien died from acute potassium cyanide poisoning. The dose was lethal, sufficient to kill an adult. Investigators examined the Pixie Stix candy. The plastic tubes had been opened, poisoned, and resealed using staples. Chemical testing confirmed cyanide inside the candy. Police recovered 4 additional Pixie Stix that O'Brien had distributed that night. All 4 were also poisoned. None of the other children had eaten theirs. One of those poisoned candies nearly killed another child. A 5th child, from a neighboring family, was later found asleep in his bed, still holding the Pixie Stix O'Brien had given him. He had tried to open the tube, but couldn't. The staples used to reseal the candy were too difficult for him to remove. He fell asleep before he could eat it. That small mechanical obstacle, nothing more than a staple, saved his life. Investigators noted that this was not a failure of planning. The candy was poisoned. The delivery was complete. Survival came down to chance. Police then examined O'Brien's account of the dark house. The homeowner he accused was identified by name, Courtney Melvin. Investigators verified Melvin's whereabouts through employment records and supervisor testimony. Melvin was working his shift at an air traffic control center during the entire trick-or-treating window. He was not home. He could not have handed out candy. The house was dark because it was empty. At that point, the investigation pivoted. The possibility of an unknown stranger was no longer unproven. It was eliminated. Investigators also uncovered testimony from a coworker who stated that shortly before Halloween, O'Brien asked where potassium cyanide could be purchased, explaining that he needed it for cleaning purposes. Police later confirmed that O'Brien had been seen at a chemical supply store, but investigators never found a receipt, transaction record, or witness confirming a purchase of cyanide. This distinction mattered. The prosecution did not claim they could trace the poison to a specific store. They argued intent through behavior, inquiry, timing, chemical knowledge, and exclusive access to the delivery method. Then came one of the most damaging details in the case. At approximately 9 a.m. on November 1st, 1974, less than 12 hours after Timothy's death, O'Brien contacted one of the insurance companies holding a policy on his son. He asked how quickly the policy would pay out. This call occurred before funeral arrangements, before public confirmation of the cause of death, and before investigators had completed their initial work. In court, prosecutors framed this not as confusion or shock, but as behavior consistent with prior planning, attention shifting immediately toward reward. Ronald Clark O'Brien was arrested on November 5, 1974. At trial, the prosecution relied on documents, timestamps, toxicology, and access. The jury heard about the insurance policies, the poisoned candy, the disproven alibi, the co-worker's testimony, the chemical supply store sighting, the near-fatal fifth child, and the 9 a.m. phone call. They deliberated for less than an hour. On June 3, 1975, O'Brien was convicted of capital murder. Under Texas law, the jury determined the crime was deliberate and that he posed a continuing threat. He was sentenced to death. After years of appeals, Ronald Clark O'Brien was executed by lethal injection on March 31, 1984, at the Huntsville unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He maintained his innocence until the end. The evidence did not change. Attention now shifts to Case 6. What motive exists when the victim is vulnerable, anonymous, and unprotected? This case does not begin with rage. It does not begin with conflict. It begins with opportunity. On Halloween night, in a city crowded with costumes and alcohol, Chris Jenkins became something dangerous in the wrong hands. Not a target because of who he was, but because of what he lacked in that moment: protection, clarity, and witnesses who stayed. Understanding this case requires abandoning the idea that motive always looks like anger or revenge. Sometimes motive is simpler. Sometimes it is the recognition that no one is watching. On October 31, 2002, Chris Jenkins was a 21-year-old University of Minnesota student celebrating Halloween near campus. He wore a caveman costume, fur, club, bare feet, unremarkable for the night. Shortly after midnight on November 1st, Chris was ejected from Lone Tree Bar. Bar staff described him as intoxicated but not violent. Chris was not removed because he posed a threat. He was removed because he was impaired. From a forensic psychology perspective, this is where motive begins, not in intent, but in risk visibility. An intoxicated person alone at night represents reduced situational awareness, slower response time, increased compliance under pressure, and diminished credibility if something goes wrong. These are not character flaws. They are predictable human conditions. Surveillance footage shows Chris leaving the bar area alone, walking south toward the river corridor. At one point, he makes a phone call. This is the last moment where multiple systems overlap: private security, public surveillance, peer groups, and public space. After this point, no system actively intervenes again. Chris Jenkins disappeared that night. His family reported him missing almost immediately. Friends searched, flyers were distributed, volunteers checked riverbanks. Law enforcement, however, arrived quickly at a conclusion: accidental drowning. The logic followed a familiar pattern: young, male, intoxicated, near a river. This assumption did more than guide the investigation. It closed it prematurely. No aggressive crime scene reconstruction was initiated. No early forensic urgency was applied. No alternative hypotheses were treated as equally plausible. From a systems perspective, this is where motive becomes invisible. Because if the death is assumed accidental, no one needs a reason to harm him. Opportunity disappears as a line of inquiry. And when opportunity disappears, so does accountability. The investigation waited for the river to confirm what had already been decided. On February 27, 2003, Chris Jenkins' body surfaced in the Mississippi River downstream from campus. He was still wearing parts of his Halloween costume, and his wrists were tied behind his back with shoelaces believed to be taken from his own shoes. This detail fundamentally alters the case. This configuration is not consistent with accidental post-mortem entanglement. Independent experts noted that river debris could not realistically produce this positioning. The medical examiner ultimately ruled manner of death, homicide, cause of death, undetermined. This is an important distinction. The examiner did not claim certainty about how Chris died, but concluded that human restraint and circumstances made an accident implausible. River experts also raised concerns about timing. Based on body condition and winter river dynamics, investigators questioned whether Chris had been submerged for the full 4 months. This introduced a deeply unsettling possibility that his body may have been placed in the river long after his disappearance. Not proven, but no longer dismissible. At this point, motive re-enters the case, because restraint requires intent, and intent requires a reason, however banal or predatory that reason may be. Under pressure from Chris Jenkins' family and forensic experts, the case was officially reclassified as a homicide. But reclassification does not restore lost time. Witnesses had not been interviewed when memories were fresh. Surveillance gaps were never filled. Potential leads had gone cold before they were recognized as leads. No suspect was ever charged. The system corrected its conclusion, but not its consequences. Case 7. Sister Tadia Benz was 76 years old, a nun, a teacher, a woman whose life followed structure, repetition, and restraint. She lived inside a Catholic convent in Amarillo, Texas, where days were predictable and nights were quiet by design. Nothing about her life suggested danger. Nothing about her surroundings demanded vigilance. On the night of October 31st, 1981, Halloween, those assumptions held. And that is what made the delay possible. By the next morning, Sister Tadia Benz would be found raped and murdered in her bedroom. The violence did not announce itself. It did not trigger alarms. It did not interrupt the night. This was not a crime defined by spectacle. It was defined by absence, of noise, of urgency, of early concern. What happened in Amarillo that night was not only a homicide, it was a case study in how systems misread time, safety, and warning signs, especially when nothing appears out of place. The St. Francis Convent was not built for surveillance. It was built for routine. Silence was normal. Locked doors were not always expected. On Halloween night, that normalcy widened. Halloween distorts perception. Footsteps are expected. Voices outside are not unusual. The idea that something might be wrong is softened by the assumption that the night explains it. No one checked on Sister Tadia Benz immediately. Not because of neglect, but because there was no trigger demanding concern. This is how delay becomes structural. Institutions respond to disruption. They struggle with absence. Sister Tadia Benz did not miss a scheduled event that night. She did not fail to appear where she was expected. The system had no reason to activate urgency. Hours passed. When her body was discovered the following morning, the medical findings were unmistakable. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. The violence was direct and personal. From an investigative standpoint, the time gap mattered immediately because physical evidence degraded. The offender had distance. The timeline narrowed to speculation rather than interruption. But beyond evidence, something else was lost: the chance for prevention. This was not a crime that happened too fast to stop. It unfolded slowly enough to go unnoticed. The investigation focused on Johnny Frank Garrett, a 17-year-old who lived across the street from the convent. He was not a stranger passing through. He was local, familiar to the area, close enough to notice patterns. Garrett was arrested, tried as an adult, and convicted of capital murder. The prosecution's case relied on physical evidence, jailhouse informant testimony, and statements attributed to Garrett. He was sentenced to death. From a forensic psychology perspective, the crime itself does not suggest careful planning. It suggests escalation. This matters. Crimes involving sexual assault followed by lethal violence often reflect loss of control rather than premeditation. Once confrontation occurs, the offender's priority shifts from escape to dominance. Violence increases not because it is necessary, but because restraint collapses. Garrett's age was central and controversial. At 17, he was legally processed as an adult, despite documented concerns about his background, psychological development, and vulnerability to coercion. His defense raised serious questions: reliability of witness testimony, handling of evidence, and the influence of interrogations on a juvenile suspect. Those arguments did not overturn the conviction, but they seeded doubt. Garrett maintained his innocence throughout appeals. The legal system moved forward. The machinery of punishment continued. And once that machinery starts, stopping it becomes harder than questioning it. On February 11, 1992, Johnny Frank Garrett was executed by lethal injection in Texas. He was 28 years old. In the final days before his execution, something unusual occurred. The Catholic Bishop of Amarillo publicly called for clemency, not because he dismissed the crime, but because he questioned the certainty of Garrett's guilt and the morality of executing someone convicted as a juvenile. International observers echoed concern. Journalists revisited the evidence. Advocates pointed to inconsistencies. The execution proceeded anyway. Case 8. Late on Halloween night, Carl Jackson was driving through his neighborhood. With him in the car was his girlfriend's young son. The night was active, crowded, and unpredictable. Streets that were usually familiar felt different after dark, filled with movement, noise, and the restless energy that comes with a holiday built around mischief and anonymity. Cars slowed and stopped. Groups gathered on corners. The ordinary rhythms of the neighborhood were temporarily replaced by something looser, less orderly, and harder to read. Halloween is a night when boundaries soften. Mischief is expected. Disorder is tolerated. Acts that might feel threatening or alarming on any other night are often brushed aside as part of the atmosphere. Egging cars, shouting at strangers, testing limits. These behaviors are frequently dismissed as juvenile antics, framed as fleeting and harmless. But loosened boundaries do not remove danger. They only delay it, allowing tension to build unnoticed until it finds an outlet. On October 31, 1998, in the Bronx, New York, Carl Jackson, just 21 years old, was shot and killed after an encounter that began with eggs striking his car. What followed was not an explosion of violence driven by a single moment of rage, but a sequence of choices that unfolded across time, distance, and intent. Each step offered an opportunity for the situation to end. Each step also allowed it to continue. That night, groups of teenagers moved through the neighborhood throwing eggs at passing vehicles. It was a familiar Halloween pattern in New York City in the late 1990s. Illegal, disruptive, and often minimized as seasonal misbehavior. Drivers were inconvenienced, cars were dirtied, tempers were tested, but most incidents ended without further consequence. When Jackson's car was hit, he stopped. He confronted the teenagers responsible, stepping out of his vehicle to address what he saw as disrespect and vandalism. Police reports later noted that the argument did not center solely on the egging itself. According to those reports, comments were made about the costume Jackson's girlfriend was wearing. What might have remained a dispute over property damage shifted into something more personal. That shift was noted because property damage can feel abstract, something that can be cleaned, repaired, or dismissed. Personal humiliation does not operate the same way. Insults strike at identity and pride. They sharpen emotion, accelerate escalation, and narrow judgment, making it harder for anyone involved to step back. Still, the confrontation did not end in violence. Carl Jackson disengaged. He got back into his car. He drove away. With a child in the car, Jackson chose distance. He chose removal. He chose to end the risk. His decision reflected an attempt to de-escalate, to leave the confrontation behind rather than prolong it. In many narratives, this is the point where the story would end, a heated exchange diffused by withdrawal. But the encounter did not end when Jackson left. Curtis Sterling, 17 years old, followed him. Several blocks passed. Time passed. The original argument was no longer visible, no longer immediate. Opportunities to disengage existed. This was no longer a shared argument unfolding in the same physical space. It was a pursuit. That distinction is critical. It introduces distance, deliberation, and choice. The violence that followed was no longer bound to the heat of an argument shouted face to face. It was shaped by movement, continuation, and the decision not to let the encounter end. At a different location, several blocks from where the egging occurred, Sterling fired a single shot into Jackson's vehicle. The gunshot collapsed the space between decision and consequence. Carl Jackson was struck. His car came to a stop. The child survived. Jackson did not. By the time investigators arrived, the moment itself was already gone. The voices, the motion, the tension, all of it had vanished. What remained were measurements, trajectories, and fragments of memory left behind by witnesses trying to recall events under stress. Witness accounts conflicted. Some described fear. Others described anger. No single perspective captured the entire sequence from start to finish. Physical evidence established movement and distance, confirming that the shooting occurred away from the original confrontation. But intent remained interpretive, something reconstructed rather than observed. Sterling was arrested and charged with murder. Prosecutors emphasized pursuit, the decision to follow after the confrontation had ended, and the use of a firearm after disengagement, arguing that these choices demonstrated responsibility rather than impulse alone. Adolescence is a period marked by imbalance. Emotional response develops faster than restraint. Peer presence amplifies reaction, increasing the weight of perceived disrespect and the pressure to respond. But explanation does not equal excuse. Psychological context can help explain vulnerability to escalation, but it does not erase the consequences of choices made. The investigation continued beyond the shooting, extending into the days that followed. In that period, Sterling attempted to sell the firearm used in the killing. The buyer, unknown to him, was an undercover police officer. According to police reports, Sterling told the officer, "I killed a guy in the Bronx with it." The statement did not emerge in the chaos of confrontation or the confusion of the immediate aftermath. It came later, after time had passed, and it became a key piece of evidence in establishing responsibility and awareness. At trial, the case centered on intent, pursuit, and consequence. Prosecutors emphasized who Carl Jackson was beyond his final moments. At 21 years old, he worked as a computer programmer at Morgan Stanley, a detail used to illustrate stability, direction, and the sense of a life moving forward. The point was not to rank worth, but to underline loss. A young adult with plans, employment, and responsibilities whose life ended after choosing to walk away from a conflict. Curtis Sterling was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The sentence marked a legal conclusion, but it did not simplify what happened. The story remained one of delayed danger, of escalation after disengagement, and of how a night defined by loosened boundaries allowed a series of choices to unfold until there was no space left for reversal. Attention now shifts to Case 9, a large Halloween party, unofficial, unsupervised, and fueled by social media, had spilled into the street. Teenagers crowded a residential property well past midnight. There was no organized security, no crowd control, and no clear authority. In the early hours of Saturday, November 1st, 2025, that absence of structure turned deadly on Old Plank Road in northwest Charlotte. Police were called to the scene after gunfire erupted inside the crowd. When officers arrived, they found 17-year-old Amari Cooper suffering from a gunshot wound. She would be pronounced dead. This is not simply a story about a shooting at a party. It is a case study in how predictable conditions repeatedly lead to irreversible outcomes, and how the systems meant to protect young people often arrive only after harm has already occurred. When celebration replaces responsibility, violence doesn't need intent. It only needs space. The party on Old Plank Road was not planned through official channels. There were no permits, no adult supervision structure, no security presence. It grew the way many modern teen gatherings do, through reposts, direct messages, and word of mouth, until the crowd exceeded what the property and neighborhood could safely hold. Cars lined the street, music echoed across yards, movement became constant, visibility dropped, accountability dissolved. This environment matters. Decades of forensic and developmental research show that large, unsupervised adolescent gatherings carry elevated risk, especially late at night. teenagers experience heightened emotional reactivity, increased sensitivity to peer perception, and reduced impulse regulation, neurological realities that do not require malice to become dangerous. Amari Cooper was part of that crowd. She was a student at West Charlotte High School, described in reporting as an honors student. She was also a young mother, raising a 2-year-old daughter, a responsibility that anchored her life beyond typical teenage priorities. There is no indication from police statements that Amari was armed. She was not identified as an instigator. She was one of many teenagers navigating a space that had grown unstable. Sometime after midnight, gunshots were fired. Charlotte-Mecklenburg police were dispatched to the 6100 block of Old Plank Road shortly after 12:20 a.m. Officers located Amari suffering from a gunshot wound. Despite emergency response, she was pronounced dead. The party ended instantly, but the conditions that made the violence possible had been in place long before the first shot was fired. The homicide investigation that followed faced immediate challenges, none of them unusual in cases like this. Hundreds of people had been present. Lighting was poor. Music and crowd noise distorted perception. Witnesses fled simultaneously. Charlotte-Mecklenburg police classified the case as a homicide. Investigators confirmed the cause of death as a gunshot wound and recovered physical evidence from the scene. But forensic evidence does not explain intent, sequence, or motive on its own. Investigators rely heavily on witness cooperation, and in chaotic youth gatherings, cooperation is often fragile. Fear of retaliation, fear of legal consequences, fear of social fallout. This silence is not accidental. It is structural. Teen witnesses frequently weigh honesty against survival in their social environment. In these cases, memory fragments exist, but context disappears. Police issued public appeals for information. Detectives reviewed cell phone footage, social media activity, and tips. Each lead required verification. Each account had to be cross-checked against time, movement, and location. As of extended reporting following the incident, no arrests had been publicly announced, highlighting a critical reality. Crowd-based youth homicides are among the most difficult cases to resolve. The system can collect evidence. It cannot compel courage. And without testimony, accountability slows. Criminal investigations narrow toward individuals. But this case expands outward. Because Amari Cooper did not die only because someone pulled a trigger. She died in an environment where multiple safeguards failed at the same time. No supervision, no crowd limits, no intervention when tension rose, and access to a firearm in a space filled with teenagers. Each failure alone might seem minor. Together, they became lethal. The justice system can assign guilt. It cannot rebuild the environment that allowed the violence to occur. That is why closure remains incomplete. Case 10. Lisa Ann French was 9 years old on October 31, 1973. She lived in Fond du Lac County, Wisconsin, a place where Halloween still operated as a shared ritual rather than a supervised event. The holiday belonged to children, streets filled with movement. Porch lights signaled welcome. The evening relied on an unspoken agreement that everyone was participating in the same harmless tradition. In that environment, children walked between houses alone. Adults opened their doors without suspicion. Familiar streets were assumed safe by default, not because anyone had tested that belief, but because there had been no reason to doubt it. Trust was not something discussed or evaluated. It was simply present, woven into daily life. That Halloween night, Lisa went trick-or-treating by herself. What happened to her would later be described as a solved case. An arrest was made, a trial was held, a sentence was imposed. The legal process moved forward in a way that suggested completion, as though the sequence of events had reached its proper end. But the deeper significance of this case does not lie in its resolution. It lies in what the investigation exposed about access, opportunity, and the quiet ways violence against children often unfolds. Not through chaos, not through sudden intrusion, but through moments that look ordinary, pass unnoticed and offer no immediate signal that something is wrong. Fond du Lac County in 1973 was not unusual. Nothing about the town set it apart as reckless or negligent. Halloween was loosely supervised, as it was in countless other places across the country. Younger children often went out alone for short periods, expected to stay close to home. The assumption was that neighbors would notice problems before harm could occur, that familiarity would act as a safeguard. Lisa Ann French left her home that evening wearing her costume and carrying a bag for candy. She moved through the neighborhood in a way that did not draw attention. Multiple witnesses later confirmed seeing her walking calmly, stopping at houses, knocking on doors, and continuing on without distress. Nothing about her behavior suggested fear or urgency. She was doing what she had done before, in a setting that felt routine. At some point during the evening, Lisa encountered Gerald Turner, a resident in his early 20s. Turner lived nearby. He was not a masked intruder or an unknown figure emerging from the dark. He was part of the same environment Lisa had been taught to trust. His presence did not break the pattern of the night. It blended into it. Turner lured Lisa under pretenses and took her away from the immediate neighborhood. There were no witnesses to this moment. No raised voices, no visible struggle. Whatever occurred between them did not register as an emergency to anyone nearby. The transition from safety to danger happened quietly, without drawing notice. When Lisa did not return home, concern grew. Time passed. The familiar rhythm of the evening broke. Her family notified police. A search began that night and continued into the following days, expanding outward as hope slowly gave way to fear. There was no immediate crime scene, no obvious location to seal off, no single point where investigators could say with certainty that something had gone wrong. There was only the absence of a child and a growing collection of unanswered questions. Several days after Lisa disappeared, the investigation took a grim turn. Her body was discovered wrapped inside a plastic garbage bag and discarded in a farm field in Taycheedah, several miles outside the city of Fond du Lac. The setting stood in stark contrast to the neighborhood where she had last been seen. The distance mattered. This was not an impulsive abandonment nearby. It indicated post-offense transport and an effort to remove the body from the place where initial contact had occurred. The Fond du Lac County medical examiner conducted an autopsy. Testimony later presented at trial described a complex cause of death. Lisa did not die from a single, isolated mechanism that could be neatly summarized or easily explained. Medical experts concluded that she died from circulatory shock resulting from a violent sexual assault, with asphyxiation cited as a contributing factor. The fatal outcome was the result of extreme trauma. It was cumulative, not singular. This distinction reflects the forensic reality that some deaths resist simplification. To reduce them to one cause risks distorting the truth of what occurred. Investigators focused on Turner based on witness accounts, inconsistencies in his behavior, and the emerging timeline. These were not conclusions drawn from speculation, but from the alignment of evidence and circumstance. Under questioning, Turner ultimately confessed to his involvement. The confession matched physical findings and medical testimony. There was no credible alternate suspect. The investigation, once fragmented by uncertainty, began to narrow with clarity. The case proceeded to trial in Fond du Lac County Circuit Court. Prosecutors charged Turner with multiple offenses, reflecting both the homicide and the sexual nature of the crime. The jury ultimately returned a verdict of second-degree murder rather than first-degree murder, a decision that reflected how the law interpreted intent and circumstance under the statutes of the time. In addition to the homicide conviction, Turner was also found guilty of enticing a child for immoral purposes and sexual perversion. The sentencing reflected this combination of charges. Turner received a total sentence of 38 years and 6 months in prison. What you've just heard isn't fiction, it's a chapter of real life that still echoes beyond this screen. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel to help us keep these stories alive and bring the next truth forward.